But we thank you so much for joining us all the way from Cambridge, Massachusetts, here at Velma Jackson High School in Mississippi. We got a room full here. We're recording this for our friends at Rosa Scott, Ridgeland High School, and Germantown High School as well. So this will be seen by a lot of people. And how appropriate on Black History Month to be joined by one of the top Black architects on the East Coast. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we just started today talking about the architecture and construction career cluster. So we got a lot of interesting questions for you, but we'll let you take it away. And I know you said you did have a short presentation you wanted to show as well.
Yeah, I know we don't have too much time, so I thank everyone for all of the time that they are spending to talk about this and that they're interested in architecture. So let me pull up the brief video that I wanted everyone to see. All right, so if I'm going to share my screen, you could probably get a sense of the audio. Can everyone hear the audio?
Do not hear the audio, but we see it.
Okay. So what we're seeing here is a recent project that I did, that I was a part of, that I was the senior project manager for, where we renovated an entire office floor and turned it into labs.
Wow.
And from start to finish, the project has taken almost 2 years to complete.
Wow.
And it took a lot of effort to actually make it happen. So from engaging with what we call our clients, which are the scientific community that works with us and produces a lot of interesting work, we had to understand what their needs were before we just went in and did the design. For where I was at this point in my career, where I sit now, I have to wear multiple hats, where I'm engaging in the design and also part of the team that's hiring the architects. So although I myself am an architect, I am working on behalf of what we call the owner of the project, which is the Broad Institute, where I currently work. So there's a piece to being in the construction and architecture industry where you're on the consultant side, where you're actually doing the design, which I have done for the bulk of my career. And moving on to where I am now, kind of on the other side of the equation, where I represent the owner's interests for a project and have to use a lot of my architectural skills for that. So that was just a snippet. Since I know we only have like a half an hour, I could have gone into a lot more detail on that, but that kind of gives a sense of like how a project comes together and what it starts to look like toward the end.
Yeah, but I'm glad you talked. There's a big point that I think anybody needs to understand, that when it comes to design, and I'm obviously I'm a novice, but this goes to pretty much any industry, but when it comes to designing a building, designing a house or anything, it's not just about what you think is cool. You have to listen to a customer or a client in your case, know what their needs are, because if you're going to build lab space for a high-end science field, you can't just make just any old thing. You have to know exactly what they want, exact specifications, and I can only imagine how hardcore they are at those great organizations up there in Boston.
Yeah, it's one phrase I used to have all the time was cool costs. So it actually can get really expensive if you want to design something really cool. But just anything in the reality of what we do, the expectation is that there's going to be a cost associated with getting it. From all of those, the lab equipment that you saw in the video, that had to come from somewhere, and it cost some amount of money. It has to support a very specific function. And before we can even get to that, we had to even understand what the user who was going to be using that every day, the science groups, actually needed. And that's been a big part of my career, was especially when I was doing other kinds of projects before I landed at the Broad Institute, especially when I had my own architectural practice. For a few years, starting in 2011, I had my own architectural practice, and finding what people would want to have built, it just took a lot of time before a project even came together. And I spent a lot of time just meeting with people and understanding what is it that you might want and how much money might you have to see it come to life, and what could we do in the and time and budgetary constraints to actually make it happen.
Yeah, the budget might be some important information before you start designing something. That's just something you might need there. Now, before we
Right.
get more into your career, can we talk a little bit about your educational background? Because here in Mississippi, we have two colleges. We have the University of Southern Mississippi has a great construction management program, and Mississippi State University has a great architecture program. So
Mhm.
obviously, that's the kind of people you work closely with. But there's also a
Mhm.
lot of blue collar people you work closely with that are skilled trades.
Right.
We have the community college system in Mississippi does a great job of teaching those trades that are in demand. So can you talk a little bit about your personal educational path, and then talk a little bit about some of the other people that you deal with when it comes
Mhm.
to projects?
Sure. If we start with just college, my undergrad is a Bachelor of Architecture degree that I earned from the University of Southern California.
Okay.
And while I was at the University of Southern California, I learned a lot about, of course, the technical aspects of what it means to be an architect. But in my internships and the kinds of jobs that I had right after undergrad is where I got the most exposure to the trades. And some of that, led me to just want to know more about architecture in general, but also about the sort of academic part of architecture and looking at other aspects of the field like urban design and ways to look at designing entire blocks in cities. So that led me to enroll at Syracuse University, where I got my Master of Architecture. And after doing that and studying abroad, which was probably the thing that changed my life the most, was being in a foreign country in 2 different rounds and living out there and making friends and while studying, really impacted my career, but also seeing how other people make things. What does it take in Italy to get something built? It's different than doing it here in the States. Um, uh, a lot of time had gone by before I decided, well, um, I could use a little bit more education in terms of a research degree. So I pursued my doctorate, and I was admitted to and finally finished my doctorate at Harvard University at the Graduate School of Design.
Wow.
And by doing that, I was kind of longer in my career. So some of the students tend to be a little bit younger than I was when I started, but and might have, just by the number of years, not as much exposure to the field of architecture. But I tried to bring practical understanding of what it means to practice architecture into kind of this very heady academic environment. And I think it had some great results. And my dissertation has a lot about like the nuts and bolts of putting a building together, but also these larger ideas involve deeper meanings behind design. So that was my educational path, in terms of undergrad through my doctorate. You don't really need all of that in order to be a licensed architect. After I received my Bachelor of Architecture and started to get my work experience, I could have received my license just then. But I instead wanted to pursue these other academic interests. I got my license a few years ago after fulfilling all of those requirements, but also it kind of aligned when I was actually ready to actually pass all of the tests. So that's another piece of this that I think is important, is from an architect standpoint, to have a license is a game changer. It gives you flexibility and freedom in your career to do the kinds of things you might want to do, from actually putting buildings together or teaching about putting buildings together in an academic setting. You have that extra credential. Working with the trades, I think this is the most closely I've worked with the trades in a long time. If in the videos that we showed and in some of the other work I do on a daily basis, people from pipe fitters to movers to drywall subcontractors are people that we have to engage with, mill workers all the time. There's a small office renovation that we're working on right now, where there was a custom piece of furniture, this executive desk. We couldn't just modify it. We had to find a mill worker and talk through with this mill worker shop of what we wanted and how they could actually move it from one place to the other and then modify it to fit in a different office.
Incredible.
So these kinds of things, right, come with experience, but also exposure. And I can say that at most architecture firms, until you get into construction administration, you're not really engaging with the trades as intensely because the projects aren't in construction as of yet. Once you're in construction is when you get all of the exposure to the structural trades, the steel workers, working with people that do the plumbing and the HVAC. All of that comes when the project is real. Once hammers start swinging, is what I like to say to explain that. So that's kind of it's a very important piece because you have to switch modes from design to functionality. How does this thing function? Did I design this in a way that the pipes that feed into the drainage system actually not only do they work, but are they disturbing the people that work below you on the other floors? Things like that come into consideration once it becomes real. And so there's like a piece of architecture where you might spend a lot of time on design, but once it goes into construction and construction administration, it's a different hat. And that's where the trades are very important. And having conversations with those trades or knowledge of what the trades do as early as possible is very important.
Yeah, and it all, and especially about the pipes, it could be using the right material for the pipes. It could be using using the correct amount of wires, and especially down here in Mississippi, it gets so freaking hot, it's unbelievable. And before you came on, we were talking about how the HVAC here in the South will always be in demand. And I'm sure up there it gets cold, so the heating will be in demand. But down here, it gets really hot. The AC in the summer, if it breaks down or if it's not working, there have to be people trained to do that. And it's such an important part of the construction industry, and obviously of the design as well, because I had a friend that had a house, and when it was built, the AC unit wasn't big enough to cool the whole house. So little stuff like that is a very big deal.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So can you talk a little bit about what all the Broad Institute does? Because I was reading about it, and I still don't get it myself. So you are doing a lot of good stuff with scientific stuff.
Right. So it's a scientific research nonprofit that has exploded in growth over the last 15 years, even more so in the last 5 of those 15, with the connection between Harvard University and MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where we have our institute members and core faculty come from the medical fields and are aligned with those institutes. So the Broad Institute is this quasi-academic setting where you have these academic research labs that are producing real work, but also doing things like lately processing COVID samples. You're talking millions of COVID samples have come through the Broad Institute. In the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts relies heavily on the Broad for the accuracy of those results. But there's research from endocrinologists, leading endocrinologists in the field, to cardiovascular studies, to cancer research. That's all happening within the walls of the Broad. So that's like the scientific piece. And then there's the other piece about architecture and construction. So being in Kendall Square, which is one of the tech hubs, if you will, of the greater Boston area, the Broad Institute has a footing, really close to MIT, a stone's throw from MIT campus, and then sort of down the street from Harvard, and a reasonable drive from these teaching hospitals that are in the Boston area that are a vital part of what the Broad is able to accomplish. So the architecture has to support the science. And that's where we get into the lab design. What is good lab design that supports workflows, but also the output, and also office spaces. So there's this on almost every floor of our buildings. We have 4 buildings on our campus. 2 of them are adjoining buildings that are, I would say, fairly recently constructed in the last 12, 15 years. And the modifications that we have to make to those buildings all of the time evolve with the science. And the cool thing is that since the science is always evolving, the building is always changing. And that's part of what the Broad does too. And it's not in competition with architecture firms, and it's not sort of trying to do its own architecture. That's where someone like me with architectural experience works on a team with the other experienced construction managers to hire and consult with local architecture firms that we trust to do the designs and to do the building. But we sort of know how it's supposed to look and about how long it should take for something to be completed. But the long and the short of it is, we support the science, and the science is the lead dog, if you will, from the Broad.
That's so important. That's some great work up there. Now, before I get to some of these students' questions, we would be remiss, obviously with it being Black History Month. How important is the representation of the Black community in the architectural field right now?
Oh, it's of the utmost importance. I think what I found is that there's a certain amount of bravery among Black architects that you must have in order to not survive, but to sustain and to thrive. Because if you're looking for permission to be great, then you're in the wrong place.
Absolutely.
That's something I used to tell my students all the time when I taught at Tuskegee University. But also, if you're looking for someone that looks like you, you're also in the wrong place. So you're going to have to build up your skills and your portfolio and your confidence so that you can thrive in any setting, whether you're surrounded by all Black and brown students or not. And it's just a reality of where we are. Now, in terms of representation, I think it comes at multiple levels. There's the sort of glorious piece of the lead designer, where those are rare in terms of diversity of any kind. Many of those comes from firm owners that were designers themselves or still are, and sort of have authorship over a design. So the representation starts to echo into different aspects of the architectural practice other than just being the head designer. Like, are there enough people that can do the work at sort of the mid-level, but in other aspects of the practice, where we see, are there enough architectural professors to help train? Are there enough people in the trades that can help train? Like, are there enough programs like Youth Build and things like that exist so that you can get Black and brown representation to increase? And it's not just, in my mind, representation is more of like having credentials and having expertise.
Absolutely.
And it should not come at the expense of the other. Yeah. We do not want to set a precedent, and which I'm sort of pushing against, especially at my own company. It's like, we don't want to increase racial diversity in our setting if it means diminishing anyone's credentials in order to meet those. Like, Absolutely. You still have to be able to do it, and do it at a high level. And that's what I would encourage in terms of representation, diversity of thought, diversity of background, but also diversity of expertise, and being able to do it is very important. And if I can impress upon the students on this call, is like, get all the skills that you can, but also be very diligent about it and treat it as a craft, as a trade, and do the very best that you can, so that you can move from setting to setting. You might be the person that people bring in at a company that helps to change the course of the company in terms of who you might see to your left and to your right when you walk into a room.
Absolutely. Now, I do want to get to some of these questions, and we got some really good ones. Sure. And these are all ninth graders, so these are impressive.
Wow, that's good.
It's from Eddie Myers, and he asked, "What type of skills do you need to become an architect?"
That's a good question. From where I started as an architect, it began with the ability to draw, but things are different now because drawing occurs in different ways. So one skill I would say is critical is being able to visualize.
Yeah.
Can you and visualize and take what's in your head and put it on either a computer screen or on a piece of paper? Now, whether that means to be able to sketch with your hand or use computer software, the computer software programs are dominant in our field, and being able to understand those is important to sort of the day-to-day. But I think architecture in itself, in terms of visualizing and looking at buildings and how they come together, comes from how you think about it. So it's framing a way of thought about how buildings come together and what's possible, and pushing that envelope that's important. If it comes down to special skills that someone's looking for, I would say learn the Adobe Creative Suite as much as you can in terms of Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, Adobe InDesign. But also AutoCAD is still, of course, prevalent. Revit is a software that's very important in terms of day-to-day. But I was always a fan when it came to coming up with big ideas of like 3D modeling.
Yeah.
So 3D modeling is a huge skill that if someone has the knack for it, they can start to learn about it now. From SketchUp to Rhinoceros 3D to even Cinema 4D, Maya, there's a lot of programs available that I think even have student licenses if you were to look a little bit deeper.
We actually have a multimedia academy on campus, which is unheard of at a Title I school, and we have a lot of those programs you just talked about.
Oh, there you go. Good.
Yeah. That's unheard of, but we do have that here. This is from Robert Randall, and she asked, "What is the best? What do you like most about your job?"
Well, the thing I like most about my current job is the flexibility, because, well, there's a practical part of it where there's fringe benefits of actually working at an office that vary, right? Like when my daughter was born, I had a pretty generous paternity leave. Like that's different than kind of the skills that I have to exercise on a day-to-day basis. But in terms of like the things, the day-to-day tasks, is that I'm constantly working with different people from different scientific groups.
Yeah.
And that's something that you don't get at an architecture firm all of the time.
Yeah.
Especially when you're younger in the profession. You might be on a project for multiple years at a time with dealing with just this one client. In my day-to-day, you know, my Zoom meetings, especially these days, each group is different each time. And the variety is what I think is the best thing about what I do every day at this job.
That's awesome. This is Lamar Kennedy, and he asked, "How do you manage a challenging project?"
Oh, wow. Lots of coffee, lots of communication. I think a lot, if you were to look at do a search for my emails, and the search criteria was the word clear direction, you would see that pop up in thousands of emails that I send. The challenging aspects of a project is clear direction and navigating that. You need that from who you're working with directly, because it comes down to getting it right. Measure twice, cut once, kind of like contractors would say.
Yep.
If you apply that as an ethos to how you do business every day, you can get over the challenging projects. The challenges come in different ways, right? One challenge you might have is budgetary constraints. How do you get around that?
Yep.
Well, you can't be too frugal to the point where you start diminishing the quality of something to where it either falls apart or you have to replace it again.
Yeah.
So sometimes that comes in terms of managing expectations. One challenge might be schedule. Is the project moving too fast for who's available?
Yeah.
When you do that, then sometimes you might have to, how do you work with staffing and make that happen? So there's like multiple levels of challenges. Sometimes it's design complexity. Often it comes to a term called value engineering. You have to be open to value engineering if you have a really complex design that needs to be simplified. And that's a term that I wouldn't have enough time to go into, but it's basically saying, take your idea and make it simple, and understand that there's costs involved to doing that.
Oh yeah. This is Sanaya Johnson, and she asked, "What's the biggest thing you've ever designed?"
The biggest project that I ever designed or was part of a team for was a stadium.
Oh, cool.
So when I lived in Dallas, I worked at HKS Architects, and I was in the sports and entertainment group. and I was part of the design team for the Indianapolis Colts Stadium, Lucas Oil Stadium. I think it's still called Lucas Oil.
Yeah, they had the Super Bowl years ago.
Right. And then I was on the tail end of a project for the Dallas Cowboys Stadium.
Oh,
And
cool.
both of those stadiums are huge.
Yeah.
I actually, the main project I was working on at that time was for Liverpool Football Club. It never got built, but at the time, oh, what do you say?
Anfield. I'm a big Liverpool fan, so yeah.
Oh yeah, so you know about Anfield and sort of the change in ownership a few years ago. But at that point, we're talking like 2007, 2008. There was a push to try to get a new stadium that never came to fruition. If it would have rivaled what you see in Dallas in terms of that stadium. It would have been next level.
Yeah, I remember reading about it. Cool.
Yeah, but those stadiums were the biggest. There was mixed use projects that I worked on that were built in Korea and other parts of the world that are not as big as that, but pretty big. Multifamily housing won't ever really compare to that level of scale. You're talking 2 million square feet for a stadium, but those are the biggest ones.
That's cool.
I would say the sexiest ones, the most enticing ones. When you see them, it's like, wow.
All right, I just got one more from the students. This is Donovan Harrison. He asked, "What made you want to get into architecture?"
Oh wow. The short of it is that I started off cartooning and illustrating back when I was probably not even able to write. I was really young. By 8th grade or so, my parents had saw that I had sort of a knack for drawing and illustrating, and then they saw that I was doing these designing my own stadiums by tracing the floor plans that used to be in the phone book. They don't even make phone books anymore. But I used to take those floor plans and make my own stadium out of it and do show and tell when I had company come over, like my aunts and uncles and cousins. So my parents saw that, and then they kind of cultivated those skills. So around 8th or 9th grade, I kind of knew that architecture was something I was curious about. So they put me into drafting programs and things like that at school, where I excelled. And then I explored it a little bit further in a high school exploration program at USC, at Southern California, when I was in my junior year of high school. And that kind of cemented it in my mind. Once I was on campus and doing the kind of work of an architecture student, I was sold. I was like, oh, there's no doubt I want to do this.
That's awesome. Well, we're almost out of time, and we thank you so much for joining us. Just an amazing resume. It's just amazing how humble you are, going to 3 prestigious universities. But before we go, I just have one last question, especially with it being Black History Month.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everybody that's in here with me now is a young Black student in America, and they're going to face the same obstacles that you faced, even though you've become one. You know, just your resume just blows me away, and it's well deserved, everything you've achieved. But with everything that you faced, they're going to face. It's not a matter of if; it's a matter of when.
Mm-hmm.
So with these same obstacles they're going to face as young Black kids in America, and we'll have a lot of Black kids and some Spanish speakers that watch this later. So they're all going to face similar obstacles, even if they have no desire to ever be in the architecture and construction field. How can they overcome those obstacles to become as successful as someone like you?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, I appreciate the kind words. I think for me, faith was a lot. And it depends on, you know, the audience. Like, I don't want to speak over anyone's head, but faith was very important to me. There were some really low moments, self-doubt, and also the doubt of others starts to weigh on you because you're human. But I knew what I was capable of and the vision I had for myself, and I didn't let that stop. And that's how I ended up, you know, even making it through several challenges, especially, I can't even tell you, at Harvard. You would never think, but it was probably, I faced it the hardest there, where people question my credentials, my ability to even write.
Wow.
By the time I landed there on campus. So my advice would be, perseverance is an internal struggle that you must grapple with every day. But set your sights on your goals and know that the quote that I said earlier, if you're waiting for permission to be great, then you're in the wrong place. That means you're going to endure a lot of risks. You're going to take a lot of fire, if you will, from people seeing you trying to do something and try to get in your way in different ways. if you keep that as an ethos, as a walk in life, you'll be fine no matter where you land. You can have the best bookshop, corner store, cafeteria, if you want, coffee shop, whatever you decide to do. Don't wait on the permission and the validation of others in order to be great. Fulfill that dream and pursue it with all of the energy that you have, because trust me, as you're young, your level of energy, you can't even quantify how much energy you currently have until you start having a family and getting older and realizing that you don't really have that energy as much anymore. So use it wisely while you still have it in front of you, and don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to fail forward. Make mistakes, knock your head, but keep moving forward. That's something, I mean, I can't tell you the lumps and the bruises I've endured to even get my license. I took that exam 26 times. 26 times I took the architectural license exam. So it's not like something I walked into.
Yeah.
But I wasn't going to let anything stop me.
Wow.
And that's kind of how I persevered in that moment.
Wow. What a great story. You're so inspirational. And we just, again, we thank you so much for joining us, just blown away by your credentials and everything you got going on. I know you're really busy, so thanks for making some time for us today down here in Mississippi.
No problem. Thanks to social media, we were able to connect.
Absolutely.
So
It's
I
amazing.
thank you, Greg. This was.
I got really good at this through COVID. So I've had guests from all over the country, and it was just so great to get your message here. And this will be seen by a lot of kids in our school district. So we really appreciate you taking time for us today.
Sounds good. Keep it up. This is great work you're doing. So I applaud you.
It. And it was great to meet you.
Pleasure's mine.
All right. See you, buddy.
All right. Thank you.